Hello, everybody, and welcome to the ABT Time podcast, which I got to move my mug in and out to get it into focus. It is 3:00 in the afternoon in California, which means that in Melbourne, Australia, it is 8 a.m., which means it's Dr. Jen Martin time. Good morning, Jen.
Good morning, Randy. It's a lovely sunny morning here in Melbourne. Greetings to you.
And what is in the news down there?
You don't want to know, mate. Just more lockdown, more COVID, government
Seriously?
not doing what they need to do. Yeah. We're still in lockdown. Well, not still. Cumulatively, we hit 200 days of lockdown last week.
Jesus. Wow.
Yeah, it's awesome. Love it.
But
Don't get me wrong. Lockdowns are doing what they need to do. I'm not anti-lockdown, but I'm just sick of being in lockdown.
People are not dying in the lobby of hospitals there the way they are some places.
No, we made a different choice. We've had very, very, very few COVID deaths, but we've just put in a lot of time in lockdown.
Paying your dues, I guess. Question of how much you value life. Okay. Let's not get off on that tangent. We've visited that a lot in this podcast, but today we've got another awesome guest. And I think you're seeing the pattern has emerged that this is just Randy's big birthday party and self-indulgence. Have all your buddies come appear on the podcast because all my friends are so interesting. And today is not an exception to that. So want to begin with a few little words of introduction about who our guest today is going to be. My good buddy for almost 20 years, Joe Newman, and he is one of my surf buddies. Here's a picture of us from about 10 years ago in El Salvador. On my right in this picture, for those looking at the YouTube version, is Greg Tillman, who was one of our guests a couple weeks ago with Bruce Block. He went to film school with me. And on my left is Joe Newman, our guest today, who went to high school with Greg. And about 20 years ago, I started running into Greg at parties and he was saying, dude, you got to come surf with us. And Joe is a lifelong superstar, hardcore surfer who's surfed all around the world ever since high school and is really kind of semi-pro in his skills. So Greg had already been surfing with him for a year or two, and I'd always wanted to get a lot better at surfing. And so I started going every weekend. We would drive out from Los Angeles out to Malibu to surf. And sure enough, I got a lot better very quickly. And then we began taking surf trips like this one to El Salvador. Had a great time over the years. So almost 20 years. The first 10 years that I knew Joe, we didn't have that much in common, really. He works with child behavior, and I don't have any children. So we'd sit out, surfing is this intensely social sport. A lot of the time you sit out there waiting for the next wave and everybody's chit-chatting with you in little groups of 3 and 4 surfers having a conversation, and Joe'd get going talking about child behavior and I'd just paddle away like, I got nothing in common there. So it all kind of blew by me for 10 years. But then in 2010, he published this book, Raising Lions. And I began hearing a bit more of the background of where this book had come from and his background. It's really fascinating. So Joe was an ADHD kid. He grew up in Maryland, and his parents, he was such an intense ADHD kid. They took him to doctors, and the doctors eventually got him signed up as part of a big study with the National Institute of Health there. And he was like a standout subject for them that they've studied at great depth. When he grew to be a big kid, 6'3", he was on the wrestling team in high school. And so he had an ability to work with especially kind of disciplined, challenged kids. And so when he graduated from high school, he immediately started to be recruited by schools to work with ADHD kids and kind of behavior challenged kids. And he began developing his own observations and techniques. He went to college a little bit, but he got so deep into the work with kids that he developed his own protocol, is what he calls it, and began doing that for a number of years and kind of formalizing it, and became popular and built a whole following of clients. And then finally in 2010, he wrote this book called Raising Lions, referring to the kids as being these lions that, you want them to be strong and powerful and graceful. You just want them to use it all in the right positive direction. The subtitle is The Art of Compassionate Discipline. And you can already start to see the parallels between what he does and what we do with the ABT, because we're not so much about discipline, but we are about structure with the ABT. And the fundamental thing that we look at with ABT is that there is this one mode of communication of and, where you don't try and constrain anything and you just say whatever you want. And then there's ABT that's very structured. And if you're really trying to communicate effectively, it's about drawing on the structure of the ABT. And that's the first parallel between the work that Joe does, which is that you want to raise kids, you've got to use a certain amount of discipline. You don't want to use too much to to cause harm with them. And you have 2 kids. How old are your kids?
My kids are 10 and 13, and I really like that subtitle, Compassionate Discipline, because I think discipline's super important and a lot of people shy away from it, but it's essential. But if it's not compassionate discipline, then I'm not interested. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more.
I have a feeling you're going to have some opinions in common with Joe. So this is going to be very interesting. This is great to have you here so you can add that dimension to what we're going to do. Here's his website. And he says evolved effective parenting for strong-willed children. That's it. Strong-willed children. That's what he works with. And I've heard over the years so many stories of, he's got these parents that are just worn down by their kids, and he becomes a hero figure. They bring him in to the picture and he works with the kids, and overnight, some of them, just starts to get them on the right track. On his website, here's a bunch of the logos of all the different groups he's worked with. You'd see Goop up there. That's Gwyneth Paltrow's big project. They're big fans of his work, and kind of all over the place, the Mother Company and Inside Influence, yada, yada. But also interestingly, so here's the deal with Joe that really fascinates me. And one of the core themes of what this whole podcast is about and everything with ABT, it's this divide between the intellectual and the intuitive, and intellectual being cerebral, intuitive being more experiential and visceral. That's what everything that I talk about all the way back to my first book, Don't Be Such a Scientist. It's all about, we're more interested in the practical real world. And Bruce Block, who we had here 2 or 3 weeks ago, one of our greatest guests to date, that's his whole orientation as well. That's why I wanted to have him on as a guest, was that in working with visual expression, his whole thing is theory versus practice. And he really gets worried about people get too caught up with the theory in visual expression, because there's only a little bit of theory you can use. You mostly need to get a lot of practice so you can actually use this stuff and do something constructive in the world. That's our deal with the ABT, is that the ABT is a tool that helps you with the practical side of communication. And there's just, the academic world is so filled with theorizing about how communications work, but it's done so often by people that can't communicate their way out of a paper bag. And communication is so important. You've got to be out there on the practical side. And that's Joe's orientation, which is that he doesn't have a PhD, doesn't have a master's degree, never even finished college. He just has a ton of real world experience and knowledge that is so lacking elsewhere. And the result of that is that he published that book 10 years ago. And when he did, my buddy Greg and I, we both said, "Oh, isn't that cute? You've written your own little book, Raising Lions. Good luck. I hope you sell a couple hundred copies. We'll tell our friends to buy copies if you want." Well, cut to the present. Last year, one of his clients was on Joe Rogan's podcast, 4 million listeners, raved about Joe's technique for 3 or 4 minutes. And the sales rank of his self-published book on Amazon 10 years after publication shot all the way up to the top 100 on Amazon. And it's been up around that range for a long time, and it's got over 500 reviews on Amazon. He's developed a huge following. And at the same time as the broad popular following, there have been some people in the academic world that have also discovered his work. I mean, eventually there are professors that have children that they have trouble with, and they've used his technique. And so there's a group at UC Santa Barbara who in 2017 contacted him and said, "Would you mind if we do some experiments here with the local school using your technique and kind of controlled experiments and see how your protocol works?" And so he worked with them, and he'll tell us about that in detail. There's a page on the website there. So there's both validation within the academic world as well as massive in the practical world. Here's his Amazon page with the 512 ratings. And look at this quote here from Barry Michaels, psychotherapist and New York Times bestselling author of a book called The Tools. And he's got a whole training program. I went and did one workshop with Barry Michaels and The Tools. And here's the quote that he gave Joe about this book, Raising Lions. He said, "One of the best books on child rearing I've ever read. Joe Newman describes a cultural shift that has reinforced anxiety and behavior disorders in children by negating parental authority. Even more important, he provides specific non-punitive ways for parents to help their kids by taking back their authority, filled with examples and experiences from the author's own life as a child with ADHD. The book's a treasure trove of useful information." I think the summary of it all is it takes one to know one in terms of the ADHD stuff. And I think that's the real secret that Joe's got with his technique. And the last whole thing I will offer up here is our superstar guest from last week, who so far holds first place in most entertaining guest on the ABT podcast, ABT Time podcast. Brian Bielman there in the middle. This is about 3 or 4 years ago. Joe and I went over and spent a week with Brian surfing on the North Shore of Oahu, and Brian's the surf photographer that we had on last week, who ended the show by telling the world's greatest surf story that went for 5 minutes and ended with his ex-wife storming in the room saying, "Shut up. Why are you talking so loud?" And that's Joe. So let's see. On that note, Joe, how's about if we start the show here? You want to activate your microphone? I will stop your camera and mic. I will stop sharing. And greetings, Joe. Jen, have you got an opening comment for Joe?
Look, I've got a lot of opening comments, but my first question is going to be, why did you decide on the analogy of lion, Joe? Why is this book called Raising Lions?
I think this came about from, well, first of all, I liked lions from the standpoint of most of the kids I work with have some sort of derogatory label, and lions not so much. That's, it's a way of reframing, telling a different story about the same circumstance. And I also think that it describes a cultural shift, which is that we have all of these kids whose behavior are really difficult to control, and we wonder why, but we don't have to really look that far. We've created that. And we've changed sort of the path of development for a lot of children. And we're still trying to act like they're lambs. They were lambs when they were afraid of us. They're not afraid of us anymore. And we did that, which is good. But, we got to know what's in front of us.
Yeah, I really like the lion analogy, because I think there's so many interpretations, all of which probably align with what you were hoping, because people all have their own senses of what a lion can be in the best case scenario and also in the worst case scenario. So welcome to the ABT Time podcast, Joe.
Thanks, Jen.
Jen, have you encountered some children who are lions?
In the good sense or in the bad sense, Randy?
I'm sure a little of each, right?
You'd like to think that all kids are lions, really. If you think about a lion out there feeling proud, feeling tall, feeling at home in their environment, knowing that they have this immense power that they can use when they need to, but they don't need to at other times. I like that lion analogy, because I would like to think that all kids feel that way about themselves. But of course, plenty of kids, and of course, Joe, I'd love to hear more about your childhood and your strongest memory of suddenly going, "Oh my God, I've been labeled as this ADHD kid," because of course there are kids all over the world who grow up with incredibly low self-esteem because they're made to believe that there's something wrong with them. Joe, tell us, if you think about your childhood, what comes back to you?
Well, I'd say there were three pivotal moments early. The first one was, partly this is just from the stories my mom used to tell, and there's a little bit of memory of it. But when I showed up at the playground, parents packed up their kids and left. I always had the playground to myself. That was just, they were like,
That's what surfers do nowadays when you show up at the surf break.
Well, that's what I hope,
Joe, is that because other parents thought that you'd be violent, or just because you'd be unpredictable? Or
I think both. I was physically aggressive. I was, wildly impulsive and exuberant, and and I was not taking any direction from anybody. So, so there's your first one. The second one is I went to a kindergarten and the pre-K the year before with, that was a multi-age school that did all these different things. It was a very sort of advanced sort of school. And Dr. Bond, who was the head of the school, just thought I was a little genius. And him and his wife wanted to take me to Europe for the summer. My parents wouldn't let them, but they were like, "This is the smartest kid we've ever had." The next year I went to kindergarten, and they thought I had a developmental problem and that I should be held back because I wasn't smart enough to go to the second grade. So one of these things is not like the other. And there's a bit of a contradiction happening right there. And then the third one was going on Ritalin in the middle of the second grade and feeling like it was my way of sort of surviving the culture of school. And but I was taking a pill every day. And with that pill, I believed, and kind of what I was taught is, I'm broken. I have a disorder. My brain is broken. And because my brain is broken, this lets me hide that fact from everyone else whose brain is not broken.
Geez, that you must have been one of the early pioneers on Ritalin, thinking when that you were taking it. I mean, it was kind of just getting started used with your generation, you think?
Yeah, I think in the year that I went on Ritalin, there were 50,000 children being given Ritalin in the world. Compare that to about 10 million now.
Right. Jeez.
Did it change your behavior, Joe? Do you remember the Ritalin actually practically changing your experiences of the day to day?
Yeah, I remember the first day. I mean, until then, I had to move. I had to get my hands on things. I had to be talking and learning. Everything had to be movement oriented, and I had to be engaged. If I was engaged, but that first day on Ritalin, it was just like, in some ways, it was like being stoned. It was just like,
what did you say? Stepped on?
Stoned.
Oh, being stoned. Oh, okay.
Stoned.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
So I can remember like sitting there going, oh, wow, I'm just watching everything. This is interesting. And there was a great relief because I wasn't irritating the teacher who that year I really liked and really cared about me. And I could tell. The year before, I could tell the teacher didn't like me. So it didn't really bother me that I made her life hell. But the second year, in my second grade, I loved this teacher and I could tell she loved me and I still made her life hell and I couldn't stop it. And being able to sit still and just, kind of move through the stuff, it's just like it shut off a number of areas and made it easier. It's like instead of juggling eight balls, I was juggling 2 or 1. It was like.
And what's your attitude towards Ritalin nowadays?
Well, I think Ritalin is, sort of an expedient. It's what some children need it to survive school. It's a complete misnomer that it cures anything. It doesn't cure anything. It's not altering brain chemistry from a disordered, like a recipe that you didn't add baking soda. Now you're adding baking soda, which is how it's talked about. But actually all it's doing is creating a set of counter symptoms that will mitigate the symptoms you're having a problem with. And that's really a case with a vast majority, if not all of your psychological medications, is that they're really creating symptoms because the mechanisms that control behavior and thinking and mood are complex and they're layered. And you can create another symptom that will sort of counter the symptom you have a problem with, but to go in and say you're actually changing that symptom at its core, that's a very rare thing, and it seldom happens. And seldom is there any science behind saying, "Oh, Randy has this specific thing, and we're going to tailor that to change his brain correctly." So it just doesn't work that way.
Okay, Joe, as a kid, so can I ask one more question, Randy? Joe, as a kid, did you miss being that really constantly energetic, really tactile kid, or were you kind of glad that suddenly you appeared at least to fit in better?
I missed it when I wasn't in school. When I was alone, I liked having, and my parents would let me make the choice on weekends. And I when I was alone, I preferred not to be on it. When I was in groups of people or in school, I preferred to be on it because I would otherwise my behavior sort of ostracized me.
Yeah.
So let's see. This is the ABT Time podcast. So I want to quickly start to jump in immediately on some of the connections you and I have had of the ABT framework and your work, because it's interesting to us to hear you talk about it in perspective of your thoughts. So what happened was for about 10 years ago, when Joe published that first book, I began seeking his advice on how he did that, because we self-published a book ourselves, Brian Palermo and Dory Barton, our connection book. So Joe kind of helped guide us through that. And at that point, we started talking more and more about the stuff that we're doing. And then about 2 years ago, we were running a demo day for our story circles training with the National Park Service in Nevada. And I just said to him, if I cover your travel, would you come to this thing? I'd really like you to see in depth what it is that we do with the story circles. And he did. And he came out to this, and it turned out to be the very best demo day ever. At about 50 of the demo days that we ran, which were 40 people getting together for one day in a room for all day long to do all the ABT training stuff, to get oriented to do the circles then for that program. That one was the best group ever. It was mostly communicators from National Park Service. And we had about a dozen, I think, other people I brought in that were all sorts of interesting folks. so Joe came to it and got a lot out of it. And then like about 2 or 3 weeks later, we're out surfing and he starts telling me about the story circle he was in. I was, what? I only asked you to come to demo day. He said, no, so good. I decided to do the whole training. And so he did. And in fact, he ended up in a circle with 4 scientists from the National Park Service. And Mike Strauss, you want to join us at this point? And Mike was kind of the organizer for that circle, oversaw it, how it was going. And Mike, why don't you tell us a few thoughts on how that circle ran, and particularly the role that Joe ended up playing? Because one of the things that we've kind of formalized in the ABT framework nowadays through Patty Limerick, who was one of our guests, is this term, the fool, meaning in the most constructive of ways, the idea that you have a group of people and you have this outsider who is the person who's able to come in and actually ask these questions where they don't know the content of what everybody's working on. They're just asking common sense questions about, well, why can't I understand what you're talking about? And I really don't think we should go any further until you can make it understandable to me. And the value of having that outsider, which through Patty's kind of label is the official fool, as we call it. So Mike, you want to take it from there and how that circle came together?
Yeah. I have to apologize to Randy because his memory of history is slightly different from mine.
Oops.
We started that group along with, I think, with our 2 or 3 Park Service groups, and almost immediately one of the people pulled out of it, and so we're down to 4 people. And I contacted Randy and said, "What do we do now? We could either split these up and put them in other groups, and there'd be too many." And we had been talking about this notion. Randy had said to me, "Gee, I wish I could put a film person or somebody really outside in one of these groups and see what happens." So I called him and he went, "I got just the person. I'm going to call Joe." And we thought, well, is Joe going to buy this thing of sitting with a bunch of egghead scientists? He did. I'll leave it to Joe to tell us his impressions of it. But I think my recollection of it at first was that the group sort of, what's this guy doing? He doesn't know anything about what we're talking about. And Joe kept pushing at them with just being like Patty Limerick's fool. I'm an outsider. You got to explain it to me. And I think of the 3 or 4 groups that ran that year, they got more out of it because they really had a practical and real world understanding of having to reach to the outside audience and to reach to that outer circle. So I think after that was when we realized we really had to start mixing up these groups more than we were, that we couldn't have everybody in the same area talking to each other. So it was really fascinating.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I like being the outsider in the group. I mean, I guess I'm a born outsider in certain ways. So it fit my MO. And I felt like, look, if you can't explain your 1-page proposal to me, then it's not very good. And I think that goes across the board. It's like you need to explain it in a level people understand. And I think, it really reminds me of, when I wrote Raising Lions. Initially, I sat down and I wrote like a sample 35 pages, and I gave it to all the people whose opinions I respected. Probably like 10 people who read it and give me your feedback.
Never gave it to me.
Yeah,
I said people I respected.
It's great of that. Okay.
And was before I met you, but and they all to a person came back and said the same thing. And they said, "Joe, this is crap." And they said, "Except for this little paragraph here, and then this paragraph here, and this paragraph here." Out of 35 pages, I probably had about 3 pages of usable stuff. And what I realized is that those were all stories. And that was what they loved. And by trial and error, I learned how to write stories. Now, I didn't know why my stories worked, but I did it through trial and error. And I feel like people say something about my book that I'd like to say about Randy's, which is parents read my book and say, "You've articulated what we've thought and felt all the time, but didn't know how to organize or put into words." And that's how it felt doing story circles. You know what a good story is, but you don't know why. And I think Randy teaches you how why something's a good story and how you can repeat it instead of just having random trial and error.
Yeah.
And at the core of that is structure, and the core of learning it is discipline. And that again is where I think Joe and I have converged in our approach to the world in general, which is you just got to bite the bullet. With our story circles training, it's now kind of morphed into the bigger concept of the narrative gym. And this idea of drawing on the parallels of physical fitness. You've just got to have discipline and go in there and do the reps. You've got to do these repeated exercises over and over again. It doesn't just come to you naturally. Yeah, keep going, Joe, and your thoughts about it.
The way I want to talk about the structured interactions, if I can, because I think that's important. And while I have the mic, I'm going to say the two things you got wrong in my intro.
Oh no, God! This is
look. I finished.
This is Edit Randy Day, right?
Randy, I finished. Look, I dropped out 5 times.
You had a PhD?
Ages 18, and by the time I was 40. But by 40, I finished my college degree, and then I went on and got a master's in organizational management.
Oh, is that right?
Because I think it spoke more to the kids I was working with. I wanted to study something that looked at psychological systems without being able to diagnose and medicate the population, which, you know, if you're an employee, that's not an employer, that's not an option. And I wanted to see what happened when we took that frame and put on children in schools. Now, I also, the second thing you got wrong is mostly I don't work with kids anymore. I work with parents.
Yeah.
Because I can go in and turn your kid around in a week. But when I leave, so what? You're going to have the same kid. It's the system of interaction. So the good thing about training parents is it forces me to start to think, what is it that I do precisely that changes the circumstance? And then teach parents precisely what they need to do, which then led to the UCSB study where we could precisely say, this is what we're going to measure. This is what the behaviors we want to see happening with the teachers. We can measure how much they're doing it. And this is what we can measure as the outcome. So I very much think you need a structure of how you're doing interactions. Most things are way too airy-fairy, kind of philosophical, like take this general approach and try and have this tone and always be, you know, calm and collected and peaceful. It's like, well, good luck, you know, so.
Because that's realistic in a household with children, everything to be always calm and peaceful.
Yeah, exactly.
So can I ask, when was the moment that you realized that your own experiences of growing up meant that you were in a position to help other people? Like, when was the moment that you realized you needed to write a book to help people?
Well, there was the moment I realized I needed to do the work, and then the moment I realized I had to write a book. And there was almost a 20-year gap between those two events. And at one point, I actually didn't start. Here's the third thing Randy got wrong. I did not start working with children right out of high school. From the age of 18 to the age of 28, I just traveled the world and did about 30 different jobs. And gradually I realized that I wasn't broken and disordered. And I had a big realization that I'd kind of worked this chip off my shoulder. And when I had that realization, I realized there must be millions and millions of kids having the same horrible experience I did. And that's the moment I thought, I got to go work with them. Now, I had a knack for it. So as soon as 6 months after I started doing the work, I was hired as a crisis intervention specialist for a camp of like the all-star behavior problem children. And after that, I was a hired gun kind of for years, going from school to school with difficult kids. But I didn't realize I needed to write the book until a case that I had about 14 years ago, 13. And because I'd always known what to do, but I wasn't quite sure why it worked on a psychological level. And in the middle of this very intense case, which is the case I opened the book with.
Joe, I'm sorry, I have to admit, I haven't read the book, so you need to tell me about the case.
So it was, all right. So I had been training behaviorists for an agency and going school to school. And the agency had a school where kids that got thrown out of regular school went. And there was an 8-year-old girl who'd been there for 3 years and was getting worse and worse. Now, on one day, she might be the perfect student and win the school spelling bee or get the lead in the play. And the next day she was in rages, tearing things off the wall, throwing textbooks at teachers, hiding under cars, running through traffic, spitting at teachers. And she'd been getting worse and worse. And they said, can you go in and see if you can turn this around? And just watch it and tell me if you think you can do anything. And I watched, and what I saw were these telltale signs that she had very astutely sort of trained all the adults to accommodate her in every moment in very intense ways. And everyone was walking on eggshells. And I thought, yeah, I know what that is. I can turn it around. So I wrote my first structured interaction. I wrote scripts and step by step, really like stage direction for how to handle conflict, that everyone would do the same way, like a meta parent, everything working in harmony. And I taught the team of people who worked in every capacity with her to do the same things, to work kind of in unison with a certain language that was very important, that communicated a high expectation, gave autonomy and respect, but a Loctite structure that was predictably moved in a certain way that motivated self-regulation. But while we were doing that, all the reading I've been doing in terms of psychology and development and psychoanalytic theory all kind of coalesced in my mind, and I kind of realized a developmental model that explained everything I was seeing. And at that point I went, oh, damn it, I have to write a book. I was not looking forward to it, but I knew at that point it would be more painful not to write the book than to write the book, which would be considerably painful anyway. So,
can I ask you a question? Did I get your name right? Is it Newman or is it Newton? Is it Newmeyer? What? Okay, I think I got it right. Newman.
Randy, even a clock is right twice a day.
I spend too much time out in the ocean.
Oh, that's a great cutting comment. I love it.
But I did get the factoid right that you were part of an NIH study. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it was both at Johns Hopkins and NIH. We lived in the middle of in between Baltimore and Washington, and they thought I was an extreme example of ADHD, and so a lot of sort of the pioneers in the field worked in one of those two places at the time, and so they were my doctors. And my parents, they said, "Will you bring him in so we can, have him participate in this research?" And they basically said, "Yes, we'll bring him once, but if he likes it, we'll keep going." But for an ADD, 6 and 7 year old, it was just being part of a science fiction movie. I loved it. I mean, they put wires in my head. They show me psychedelics movies. They ask me questions, and I got to figure out what they're really asking and try and trick them. It's just like, I had a great time.
Okay, let me ask you a kind of in-depth question here. And this draws parallels also from Bruce Block that we had here 3 weeks ago in visual expression and his training program. And let's see if this resonates with you in terms of growth and learning with kids. In teaching the ABT, in the beginning, lots of people said to us, oh my God, storytelling, kids are so good with storytelling and they love communication. They're so good with all their devices and social media and things like that. Your training is going to be a natural for youngsters, and older people are going to have a hard time with it. You can't teach old dogs new tricks. So we kind of headed out 7 or 8 years ago, starting this narrative training stuff with that as an expectation. And what we found has been the exact opposite, which was that the younger people don't have a context yet to really know how to apply this narrative structure stuff. Older people who have done things in the world, had experiences trying to communicate and projects and things like that. They've got a need. And once people develop a need, they're in a stronger, more intense learning mode. And now we've gotten to the point with the training where we did an episode about 5-6 weeks ago on how to teach the ABT. And I think one of the golden rules we've established is don't ever try and teach this to anybody who isn't working on a problem right now. That having a problem activates the brain in such a way that the person's reaching in for anything you can give to help me solve this problem. So as a result, in the ABT Framework course now, everybody comes in with their ABT as a starting point, and which you didn't have that really so much for your story circles. I mean, I guess you had your one shot where you did an ABT there, but this is with the course, every single person's working on their one ABT and, day in and out, and then they go and do a working circle on that. And it's that problem solution dynamic that the more we work with it, we see is all the difference in the world. And you got any thoughts on that in terms of working with kids and their behavior and what you get out of them when you can give them a problem to work on?
Well, I think, I think for me, the parallel that stands out right away is that I go into a lot of homes where parents are trying to explain to their kids why they should behave in a particular way. And so, for instance, I had a father with a 5-year-old, and he said, once a week at least, I tell my son, he's got to be a better loser, that he's got to take turns and share, that he should be nice when you're playing together with him. And every week he's the exact same way. And I think you're not going to make friends. So he's assuming that if you just explain it, then everyone will do it right. And what I told him, I'm like, your child needs to experience it. When he wants you to play a game with him, say, I'll only play that game with you when you play this game with me first. And he says, no, says, fine, play by yourself. Eventually the kid's going to come back. He's going to negotiate with you and he's going to play that. He has to have a physical experience of doing it, of learning how to share, of learning how to defer gratification, of gradually seeing that things work and don't work. And if you just keep lecturing them about it, it doesn't work. Now, I think what I like about ABT is you don't talk and study about it and then set people loose, come back a week later and see if they wrote a good story. You do it. You do it again. You do it again. Most of the 10 weeks, we're just doing it. You do it again. You do it again. You do it. And that's how you learn it. That's why it becomes a visceral thing you can actually use. I don't want somebody to give me a lecture about writing a story. I want them to write a story. And if you can't write a story, it's because you never wrote one and you didn't fail a bunch of times. And I think that the process you're following.
You're talking about the concept, the narrative gem that we've kind of developed. Yeah.
It's like the prefrontal cortex is better thought of in terms of children as a muscle. If you don't require them to defer gratification, if you don't have them exercising impulse control, doing tasks that are difficult before tasks that are preferred, no amount of lectures are going to convince them that they should all of a sudden bring out that power.
So then do you talk to the parents using that metaphor of like a gym and fitness and like a muscle?
Yeah, even more than talk to them about it, I give them specific direction. It's like, parents in crisis, people are going to go back to their most primitive gut instincts. And quite often, my expression is that people more often parent the child inside of them than they do the child in front of them. So what I mean by that is that in a moment of crisis, you're going to give that child what you needed 40 years ago or 30 years ago, but not what your child needs in front of you. And culture's changed, and how you've raised that child sometimes is radically the opposite based on your experience. And now in crisis, you're doing you're giving them what you needed. That's not what they need. And so, you have to give people a script and a way to see something else happen in front of them. And that experience changes their thinking. That experience changes their feeling about the interaction, helps them shift their instincts that might be off.
Joe, can you tell us a bit more? Yeah, I want to know a bit more about how it actually works, in the sense that I've gathered that Raising Lions is around compassionate discipline and structure, and you've talked a bit about scripts. Can you tell me a bit more about how you actually work with parents? I mean, how do you get a parent who, as you say, is in crisis mode to recognize that they're responding to their own needs more than their kids' needs? How do you get a parent to shift towards stepping back and being able to take advice, like, here's a script that would help you? I'd love just to hear more about the practicalities of your work.
Do you smack them in the face sometimes? No. Well, that's what I do.
The good thing.
Don't have kids.
What's that?
That's why he doesn't have kids.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, thank God you don't have any kids, Randy.
So I think the first problem, which is how do you convince them, is kind of solved because they call me. where they buy the book. But typically they've bought the book, they've read the book, and then they're calling me. So I don't get people calling me saying, actually, very occasionally I have somebody who calls and says, well, basically some version of, can you come and fix my kid? And I say, when your kid gets a credit card and can pay my hourly wage and calls me for the help, I'll come fix them. But until then, you called me and you're paying, so we'll work with you. Now, 99% of people who call me already know that. And so they're saying, what can I do different? Okay. And so I say, look, here's what we're going to do. I'm just going to script the moment of crisis, the moment when you're coming to heads at something. And I want you to follow that script. And for most people, it's a huge relief, because they're like, oh, thank God, because I say the worst crap in that moment. I always regret what I say, or I give in too much this way and then I explode too much this way. So they're grateful to have a thing that they can follow. And not only that, that their spouse can do the same freaking thing, because typically they're doing opposite things almost in reaction to what the other one's doing. That's a common problem. And you give them one thing and just follow through with this, because only when you follow through with, just imagine conducting an experiment, but every time you ran the experiment, you used entirely different variables. You didn't repeat it over and over. So you never saw, I got an 8. That's what we're doing with our children. It's like you have to repeat the experiment over and let them adapt and learn to adapt to that and see what happens over time.
Okay, so let me say something here, and especially Mike. Another one of the things we've learned in our training last 7 or 8 years, getting back to what I was saying before, is we can work best with you if you come in the door admitting you have a problem. And it's gotten to the point with story circles where we draw on the analogy of Alcoholics Anonymous. One of their fundamental rules is we can't help you until you begin by saying you have a problem. And once you've admitted you have a problem, then we can start working with you on it. We run into this with not a lot of people, but occasionally with story circles and things like that, of people who just already think they're really great storytellers. And I'm going to take your course, just see if there's something else to add on. They don't come in the door saying, I know I need to work hard on this. And then what you were describing just then sounds like a real luxury, but is that always the case? And there's 2 parts to it. Number one, do you always have people that are coming to you saying, we're desperate, we'll listen to anything you have to say, and we're ready to work on it? Or do you get what in my Meisner acting program, what the teacher would scream about there was, we hate having students come in who've had a lot of acting training elsewhere, because we have to deprogram them on all these bad habits they've developed and give them the right habits. Do you run into that at all?
Yeah, well, so there's 2 different areas of my work. One is with schools and one is with parents. Now with parents, I don't have that problem, because parents almost across the board, they come in and they go, we know we need some help, and help us. Nobody assigned a group of parents to me. But at a school, you might get a school where the one administrator decides, hey, this is great, I want everybody to do it. But you don't get buy-in from everybody. So now all of a sudden you've got a whole mixed bag of people with differing levels of interest and enthusiasm. And some are going to do it and some aren't going to do it. And it was one of the things that we came up against when the University of California, Santa Barbara did the study on my method over the course of a year. The one way out for that was, I said, if you don't want to do the method in your classroom, tell me, and you don't have to do it. And 2 out of 16 teachers said, we don't want to do it. And I said, perfect, you're our control group. So they met my need.
We ran into that.
Great.
Randy, we ran into that in one part when I was still back at USDA working and we were doing story circles. We did a story circle at one of their regional centers, had a real high attendance rate, had a huge number of people in it for the demo day. And then at the end, we went to do the signups, and almost nobody signed up for it. And I was wondering what happened. And one of the people in the office who was helping us finally near the end of it said to me, well, the head of the agency just walked through, or not the agency, but the head of the unit just walked through the unit and ordered everybody to go to the training. They were there because they had to be there. And when we asked them to join story circles, which was elective, everybody was like, you already made me sit through this day. I'm not going to do it anymore.
Yeah, we've really gotten down to that level where we don't want people coming in the door unless they're there on their own volition. They said, it's like the Alcoholics Anonymous thing. I'm at the point I'm finally willing to admit I have a problem. I'm not so good with narrative structure. That's the great thing with National Park Service for us, is that they've had that philosophy from the beginning. They've said, we have this mandate to be the nation's storytellers, and we don't do as good a job as we should. So will you work with us to try and improve it? And that's why they've been the dream partner for us. And then we run into other groups that just feel that they're already really good at this stuff, and they, we'll try it. But yeah, it's that demand makes all the difference. But it sounds like you get the luxury for most of these parents coming in the door already.
Yeah, the one exception that came to mind is, and this hasn't happened in about 5 years because I sort of started to weed this out, was occasionally I would get people who said, hey, I want to pay for my friend to get your training. Or, hey, my daughter is having a real problem with my grandson. I want to pay you to go to their house. Never works.
Right. Yeah. That's the same thing. Yeah, exactly.
Never works. I used to do pro bono work for some organizations that had worked with foster parents, and they would send me in to people who didn't pay and didn't really ask for the help. Didn't work.
Right.
Same situation when people were asking for help, radical difference.
Yeah, I have a different thing based on the story circles, Joe, from your experience with it. One of the things that I discovered early on was that as people went through the story circle training, they slowly stopped setting up all the barriers that people usually set up to criticism. So, the typical thing, I got my PhD working with a guy who, if he got a bad review on a paper, he would call the editor and scream and shout at them to get them to withdraw the bad review because he knew he was right. And what I saw in story circles from my side was there was some defensiveness in the first session or two, but by the end of it, people had finally realized it's not about whether I did a good job or a bad job. It's about how do we get to this good product. And I'm wondering if you saw that with that group, because I would expect initially some gut level reaction against this guy who comes in and goes, I don't understand what you're talking about. So
I saw a little bit of that in the beginning. And I think, I think there were two levels to it. One is that I like being the antagonist. I don't mind sort of saying something that I don't mind being a little offensive certainly in terms of a critical conversation, or we're doing some work together. I think I try to do that in a kind way, but I'm not going to pull the punches. And second is, you could have written me off from just, well, he knows nothing about biology, or he knows nothing about my field. But I found just a little bit of that in the first week or so, 2 weeks, I think, as we did it. But that melted away pretty quickly as people, because it wasn't just me giving some critical feedback, but as people gave critical feedback, and we found that moved the process, and you ended up with a better product. Even at the end of the session, things were improved. I think by doing it over and over and over and over again, that it wears out that sort of anxiety or resistance to failure as being a learning tool.
You know what? If we could take 30 seconds here, Mike, just you and me. Part of our problem it's not a problem, but with all the narrative training, we've done so much and run so fast. We don't get too many chances to stop and distill down and what we've learned along the way. And one of the things that's a little sad that I missed with the story circles model was that you did get those groups of 5 individuals like Joe's circle that met for 10 sessions, and some of them formed really strong bonds that still we hear from them 2 or 3 or 4 years later. Kirsten Leong, who gave one of the presentations in the Narrative Blitz, that was all about their story circle that they formed, and they worked on that feral cats issue, and the 5 people formed a bond of getting to know each other really well. We had another one with USGS where one person was a communicator, the other 4 were scientists, and she formed a bond with the 4 scientists that to this day she uses them as her little focus group when she works on a press release. She can speak this narrative language with them. So that's something that we've lost with the ABT framework course now, that we don't do that. We do the working circles, but those are only one shot. I don't know, just all the different trade-offs. But it's interesting talking with Joe, because he's a veteran of having done those 10 sessions, and that's what he's talking about. It's the iteration thing. I mean, that's what we just learned the last 3 weeks or so with the conversational ABT. There we've been doing the conversational ABT for 5-6 years, and suddenly by doing it iteratively now with 10 people in a row, bing, 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 everybody finally gets it in a single session. So that, God, you just can't emphasize enough how important the repetition, the iteration is, right, Joe? Yeah, I mean, that's really great to hear you making that note from the very beginning. Yeah,
it definitely it loosened everybody up.
Yeah. That's
Joe, can I ask you something, Joe, that I'm really interested in? One of the things that we come up with when we talk about the ABT is the idea that really good narrative structuring is often invisible to the audience. The audience can't quite pinpoint why they're so massively engaged with a story. They just know they are, and it's only later that they kind of go, oh yeah, that was really tightly structured. I'm thinking about the sort of work that you do from the kid's point of view. Like, obviously the kid must recognize that all of a sudden they're being spoken to really differently. They're being kind of held in a different space. What's it like from the kid's point of view? How much are they aware of this whole new scripting that they're hearing? And how different would your childhood have been if the people around you had some of the scripts that you create? I really want to hear about it from the audience's point of view.
Great question.
So I have a story to answer that question. That I will say,
excellent. We like stories here.
Well, let me start by just saying, by the time I left high school, I was just super defensive. I was not going to take any direction. I didn't like any boundaries, and partly because boundaries and rules and correction were all paired with a kind of humiliation. And so I had a deep sensitivity to this when I started working with difficult kids. So the first summer I'm working with at this school at this camp for behavior problem children. It was actually the second summer, and I was the head of education. And don't ask me how without a degree, but I'm head of education. I've got 10 super hyperactive kids in the classroom, and we start off, and I have a method where I say, Randy leans over and he gives Mike a smack, and I say, Randy, I need to take a break for a minute. You can stand right at the threshold of the door. And Randy says, no, Mike's, been teasing me the whole class. And I say, look, I can't talk about it, but in 5 seconds, it becomes a 5-minute break instead, and my friend has to drag you out. Now, I'm not mad at you, and it's no big deal. And he goes, and for, half the time you have to drag him out the first day. But I repeat this language of saying things like, look, it's I can't talk about it until later. And we can talk about it after. You can figure it out. Or I'm not mad at you. Or I didn't say you did anything wrong. I can't make you do it. And all of a sudden, it helps to smooth the process along. But the most satisfying part of that summer was 3.5 weeks in. Half the kids at camp go home, and half stay that are there for the whole summer. And the ones that went home are replaced by a new group. So you get all of a sudden a classroom, 5 kids in a class who've heard what you've done for the 3.5 weeks, and 5 who've never heard it. And you say, Jen, I need you to take a break for a minute. And you start getting upset. And Randy leans over to you and he says, and I heard one kid say to another, he's not mad at you. If you take the break, you should come right back. It's no big deal. Yes. You don't have to go, but if you go, then you don't have to do the 5-minute break. So they're repeating the autonomy. They're repeating the respect. They're repeating the lack of judgment and blame. They've internalized it. And it's really satisfying. I'll hear parents telling me that they'll hear after, a couple months of them doing this with their, with their children, that they'll hear their children say it to other children. Look, I'm not mad at you, but when you do that, I'm not going to play the game anymore. Or they'll see the kids using these tools of taking the judgment out and setting boundaries, or, giving themselves a break. It's no big deal. I need a break. And so they internalize this, and it becomes part of their psychology, which is sort of the long-term gift of it. It's not just about behavior.
Yeah, and that's culture change right there. I mean, what you just described in the camp, you enacted culture change, which then at some point, I mean, I'm sure in the shorter term of 6 weeks or whatever, you were still needed to kind of, jump in and support, but presumably over long enough, then you can kind of walk out and the culture just keeps going without you there.
Yeah. And that's my goal. I just realized I can work with, every 6 weeks I can work with one more kid, or 6 times a day I can work with sets of parents and teach them. And typically parents are done in anywhere from like 3 to 6 hours, and they're done. And I can move on to the other parents, which is perfect for somebody who, has a hard time focusing on one.
Perfect.
You've chosen the perfect job for yourself, Joe. Well done.
But we have managed to focus for an hour here, and we're just about at the end of the time. Have you got any clients in Australia over the years?
Yeah, quite a few, actually. I've got quite a few right now.
In what parts?
I pull out.
That's right. Just
Perth comes to mind. I have a couple clients in Perth. I have a client in Sydney. Victoria, is that a place?
Yeah, it's this the state that I'm in. I can guarantee you right now that there'd be plenty of families in Sydney and Melbourne, and in fact, all of New South Wales and Victoria, who would be very grateful for your help, because, we're all in lockdown. We've been in lockdown for a long time. And you read terrible things on Twitter of, neighbors getting angry because children are making noise. And the parents like, I've got 3 kids under 8 who have been essentially locked at home other than for an hour a day for months now. Of course, they're going to make noise. What do you expect? I mean, people just need some empathy, right? It drives me wild.
Joe, you should have your book translated into Australian.
Yeah.
Maybe
I'm
Jen
happy to help with that, Joe. I'm really
Exactly.
happy to work with you on the translation. That'd be great.
I can only imagine. Excellent. Well, what's in the near future for you other than lots of surfing?
I've got about 2/3 of the way through a second book. Which the title is really a result of Randy Olson. One day in the water, Randy said, tell me in one sentence, what your method is trying to communicate. And I said, your children are smarter than you think. So I think that's the title of the second book. That's the working title, at least. And
love it.
That's all we really know how to do with our training, is just make it fewer words, get it down to 5 words. That's what we're doing more and more now. Weren't we talking about that the other day? This challenge of having people say it in fewer words, what that does to people's brains. It really forces them to squeeze the story part and make it more concise.
I also think there's something about too many words that communicates a lack of confidence in your material and an anxiety that you don't really believe what you're saying. And I think people who have great business skills meetings and negotiation skills meeting, part of that is knowing when to be quiet and letting something sit, letting something uncomfortable sit, not rushing in with your anxiety. And I think in terms of parenting, in terms of storytelling, we want to go, if you're trying to over explain and go deep, at some point it's like, well, wait a minute, I believed you at this end of the second sentence, but at the end of the 5th, I don't believe you anymore.
Yeah. Long ago, right before I came to film school, I bought a whole bunch of books on Hollywood and filmmaking. There was one book I wish I still had it to this day. And it was just how to survive in Hollywood. And in there was one section on how to know the difference between a heavyweight and a lightweight. And when you're in the business trying to look for the people that actually can get your movie made or something, and it had all these characteristics of a heavyweight versus a lightweight. And one of them, was a lightweight is always flat out busy and, just I'll try and squeeze you in for a meeting. And a heavyweight, it's got all the time in the world, yeah, we can talk right now. And characteristics like that. And a lightweight talks, fills all the space. And a heavyweight just says a few words, same thing you're saying there, just knows the whole thing. And that's a lot of what we've come to realize. It's this stuff about context and experience. What experience gives you is that ability to shrink this stuff down into the core essence. And when you're new and young and getting going on things, you just don't know it yet. It's through that iteration you begin to find out what's more important. And this is what we learned with the ABT, is that young people have a hard time with the blue material, the opening, the setup, the context, until they really have learned their world. They don't know what to put there at the beginning. They know how to get to a problem and talk about a solution, but it's all about the setup and the context. And that is through life and experience. And that's the essence of the iteration thing, I think, over and over again. So one of the best things I've heard you talk about in this hour has been just your understanding, the appreciation for how powerful the repetition is. And that you see that over and over again in effective training programs, I think. And that's the problem that the academic world runs, is that they don't like to repeat things. It's really anathema in the academic world. It's let's get on to the next thing new. Oh, let's stimulate your brain. Here's something new. That's great intellectually, but intuition building requires the repetition.
Yeah.
Got any final thoughts for us here, Joe?
I don't know. I have a lot of final thoughts.
Anything ABT related? Because we do talk a lot about ABT.
Well, I do love, I've been just thinking that my whole career is based on creating a different story. Okay. If you really want to change the thinking around something, you can choose to, you're going to jump into a field. You have a choice. You can add your and to the longest story with the 25,000 ands in it.
Wait, slow this part down. You were telling me this yesterday, and I cut you off. I said, this is what I really want to hear. So yeah, nice and slowly.
Randy said, how do we know you're not a guy who just has a chip on his shoulder because he couldn't get a PhD? And I said, look, at some point I realized that a PhD in the field I was interested in was just like adding the 25,668th and to a story that already had 25,667 of them. And that if I could add that extra and, they would give me this certificate, and I would be part of their club, and I could get paid according to scale. But the problem was I just didn't like the story. It was boring. I couldn't get through it, and I didn't like the part I read. So I was going to write another story. And so mine was just a different story. I thought, sometimes I look at the conventional thinking in terms of children and the heavy leaning toward diagnosis as that's the prosecution. They're trying to prove guilt. Well, guess what? I'm the attorney for the defense, and that's my story.
Nice. That was excellent. Perfect. What a perfect finishing point. And thanks very much for joining us, Joe. And Jen, always great to see you. Mike, I'll be seeing you tomorrow in both sessions of the ABT Framework course. And Joe, I'll be seeing you out on the ocean very soon.
In the water.
In the water, exactly. Surfing. Cool. Thanks, everybody. And tune in next week for, we don't know who will be the guest, but it'll be somebody really fun and interesting. See you,
Thanks,
Jen.
Joe. So great to talk with you.
You too, Jen. Nice to meet you.
Bye-bye.
See ya.